Progressive presents The Sounds of the Old World. The year is 2019, and someone is waiting for a table at a restaurant.
Thompson, party of four. Thompson, party of four. Thompson, party... Oh, there you are.
This has been The Sounds of the Old World. Brought to you by Progressive, where drivers can still switch and save like it's 2019.
Quote today at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates.
The fundraising will help, which will turn into ads, which will clog screens.
On this episode of Transition Virginia.
The timing that Jones has to expand his name ideas, that window is quickly shrinking.
The Democratic primary for Attorney General.
Do you need a new office to do this, or can you just do it?
We're joined by Leonor of the Richmond Times-Dispatch.
Northam is very interested in there being a candidate from Hampton Roads.
And Brad Kutner of Courthouse News.
I'm very boring at parties.
Mark Herring versus Jay Jones.
There's no one making the case it's time to fire Mark Herring.
On this episode of Transition Virginia.
Geico presents Motorcycle Word of the Day. Today's word is gremlin. Is a gremlin an unknown and persistent mechanical issue? Or is it something large that gets caught in your teeth when you ride with your mouth open? As in...
Man, I gotta stop singing 80s power ballads when I ride. Ugh, keep getting gremlins in my teeth. See?
Geico Motorcycle. 15 minutes could save you 15% or more.
Welcome to Transition Virginia, the podcast that examines the ongoing transition of power in Virginia. I'm Michael Pope.
And I'm Thomas Bowman. Today on the podcast, the Democratic primary for Attorney General. Incumbent Attorney General Mark Herring is being challenged by Delegate Jay Jones. What are the issues in the campaign, and what are the politics of the election? We have a dynamic panel to talk about the primary. We're joined by the Virginia politics reporter for the Richmond Times-Dispatch, Leonor. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
We're also joined by the Richmond reporter for Courthouse News, who's also the secretary-treasurer of the Virginia Capital Correspondents Association. Brad Kutner, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me as well.
Okay, well, let's start with our incumbent Attorney General, Mark Herring. He served as the town attorney for Lovettsville and a member of the Loudoun County Board of Supervisors before being elected to the state Senate, where he served 8 years before being elected Attorney General in 2013. He was reelected in 2017, and now he's seeking his third term in office. On the campaign trail, this is how he talks about his time in office.
The first thing I did was go into court and say, no, we are not defending an unconstitutional ban on marriage for same-sex couples. We're going to fight for marriage equality, and we won. And now look at the progress we've made. Since then, I have transformed the office and shown Virginians just what an attorney general can do for them. We've protected the Affordable Care Act and Planned Parenthood, got an in-state tuition for dreamers. We've fought to defend our new gun safety laws, fought against dangerous white supremacist extremism. I returned over $350 million to Virginians in consumer relief. And I led the effort to stop Trump's racist Muslim ban. And when Republicans wanted to keep their racially gerrymandered districts, I fought them in the U.S. Supreme Court and won, and Democratic wins followed. I have proven that I can win even the biggest fights, and I've transformed the job into a progressive powerhouse.
So what do we make of Herring's time in office? Has he really been a progressive powerhouse?
Well, I started covering Herring in 2019, and at that point he had already made a lot of news for kind of being aggressive toward the Trump administration. I think that's most of what I saw at that time. Right when I started covering too, that's when he acknowledged that like Northam, he too had been in blackface, and I think that that was an important time. During his time in office, he, like Northam, spent a few months in hiding and then came back and started pursuing cases against Purdue Pharma, for example. And so I think kind of made a name for being pretty aggressive at the federal level.
So the first time I met Mark Herring was actually at an LGBTQ fundraising event for his first campaign when I was still the editor at Gay RVA. I kind of crashed a fundraising party that I probably shouldn't have been at. Both him and Northam have their long history in the legislature. Both of them voted in support of the ban on same-sex marriage, but that's back when everybody was okay with making gay marriage illegal. So I kind of watched him and the state advance from that. And I essentially followed him and his career closely on that point in specific. One of my favorite photos of all time is him issuing a marriage license to the first same-sex couple on the steps of the Richmond John Marshall Courthouse. Yeah, I mean, I've definitely seen him go from a Virginia Democrat. I always joke that a New York Republican is a Virginia Democrat. I guess they call them blue dogs, right? So I've seen him be a part of the Virginia Democratic establishment, and then saw him get more progressive on social issues as it was politically convenient until we get to the blackface scandal, where obviously a lot of blackface scandal, George Floyd, a lot of the criminal justice reform stuff kind of kicks into overdrive. So you wouldn't have called Herring a progressive until Trump came to office, until some of the civil rights issues really started to come to the forefront. So it's been neat to see, but I also am not surprised to see some of the attacks from the other fellow we're going to talk about here, Jay Jones.
Yeah, you mentioned Jay Jones, so let's talk about him. Anytime a challenger wants to unseat an incumbent, they've got to make a case for why that incumbent should get fired. This is Delegate Jay Jones talking about his background and why voters should fire Herring and hire him.
My grandfather, Hillary Jones, was a pioneering civil rights attorney here in Norfolk. He got really involved in the movement, even had my dad and my uncle integrate a school here in 1961. And so every time I'm upset, dejected, frustrated, I think about their struggles and how I stand on their shoulders. And as we move into 2021 and beyond, we have a real opportunity here to redefine ourselves about what we value, highlight, prioritize. We can chart a new course in this new Virginia decade. And I think now is the opportunity for us to really highlight our diversity. This state is 8.5 million people and growing. It is not the Virginia of 2017, of 2013, of my parents' generation. This is a new place, a new dominion. And we've done so many wonderful things in the legislature over the last few years. But I will tell you that now is our opportunity to really lean into the fresh faces, the new voices, and the different perspectives that have traditionally been left behind.
You'll notice that Jay Jones points out that today's Virginia is not the Virginia of 2013 or 2017, the 2 years Mark Herring was elected and reelected Attorney General. Is this message of generational change going to work with Democratic voters, Mel?
I think when you talk about some of the issues that Herring's been passionate about, Brad was talking about the fight for gay marriage, for example, or definitely Herring made a big splash pushing back on Trump policies. That's just, I think it's true that isn't the America or the Virginia that the future AG would have to oversee. I think that based also on the endorsements that Herring has gotten, I think with the exception of Ralph Northam, just a lot of more establishment, long-serving Democrats. I think Jones is definitely making the case that Virginia does or could use a new face, I think is his argument. He would be the first Black Attorney General in Virginia, African-American, and at a time when he's emphasizing the push for civil rights right now, that is a message that seems to be carrying.
I like Jones a lot. I think he speaks a lot to the what a lot of politicos imagine to be a young and diverse electorate that's seeking new representation. And I think he fits the bill in a lot of ways, but I think he's going to run into a reality in the Democratic Party establishment in this primary where Herring has roots. He hasn't gotten the McAuliffe endorsement yet, though, has he? He has not been endorsed by McAuliffe. Do we know that?
I don't think so.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of a weird dynamic that exists between McAuliffe, the de facto money gun with a human consciousness that is going to take the gubernatorial primary, and whether or not he links up better or more with Herring as he had in the past. That I think will be the biggest hurdle for Jay to overcome. But the progressive message, it sounds good on Twitter and in digital ads, but whether or not it resonates with the base is really going to be hard to see.
It's always important to think about what issues are most important to the candidates in terms of how they want to frame their election. So when Mark Herring is asked about what his top priority is going to be for next term, he mentions banning assault weapons and the debate over preventing gun violence in general. Here's Mark Herring on his top priority for another term.
I have led the fight for gun violence prevention in Virginia. I started in 2013 and made it a key feature of my campaign, and I won, not in spite of it, but because of it. And together, we've been working with the advocates. We have finally, under new leadership, begun to make progress with expanded background checks, with reinstating the one gun a month law, with the red flag law, but there's a lot more work to do.
So as you heard Herring say there, he actually had this as one of his chief agenda items for his first election back in 2013 and was successful. Brad, is this issue, preventing gun violence, something that's going to resonate and push him to another term in office?
Well, it's really hard for an attorney general to write legislation. I mean, I've heard Herring try and take a lot of credit for bills, and Jones has used that as an opportunity to remind people that the AG doesn't write bills. He can advocate for bills, and you'll see members of the AG's office come and speak on behalf of things. I mean, there's a version of this election where you see the gun debate being minimized in general. Again, a lot of this sounds good in the primary because it's going to fire up the base, but I honestly think Virginia Democrats are going to be so scared of Republican turnout come November that you might see the gun legislation pushed in some of the state's bluest parts, but especially in the swing districts, and especially from the higher ups. I bet you don't see talk about gun laws, new gun laws. You'll talk about the old gun laws maybe, but I bet you don't see them talking about new gun laws after we hit the primary.
Yeah, Senate Majority Leader Dick Saslaw had a version of the assault weapons ban that he introduced, and then it didn't go anywhere. He ended up withdrawing it. Mel, is this issue of the assault weapons ban in particular going to be kind of a lightning rod heading into the fall election season?
I think Brad is right on the politics. I think as far as the State House goes, the reason that bill didn't make it through is because it didn't have the support of, more moderate Democrats in the Senate. It wasn't that, Republicans were able to successfully push back. It was that some people in the party just are not too keen on this idea, and that won't change after the fall elections. I'm sure Democrats, including Herring, in whatever office he's in, will continue to push for it. But I think Virginia is probably a ways away from seeing this legislation passed. I think you saw a big push for it, and the Northam administration and certainly Herring making a big push for it in 2019. And then I think you saw this year that bill wasn't introduced again. And I think the reason for that was that it didn't have a path.
I mean, I don't know how they write a state level assault weapons ban. This just seemed, we passed a lot of gun laws already. It just constitutionally and everything else, especially with the makeup of the Supreme Court, I think passing it seems so far out of reach, but it sounds good and a fundraising campaign, and it sounds good in a primary. Sorry. It just makes me laugh really hard about how far to the left some of the folks are going on this and how much we're going to see that reeled back.
And I think you saw the bill fall for that reason. There was a lot of debate and a lot of tinkering with the language and how it would work and when it would be implemented and in which cases you could have it or not. And I think that sort of messiness that you're talking about of like how you come up with this legislation was ultimately what I think, at least it was the tool to kill it in the end.
Also from the legislature's perspective, they would tell you that they've already done that. They only have 60 or 90 days, depending on the year, to enact sometimes generations worth of reforms. And they would say, well, we've already done guns. We've got to do something else now.
Yeah.
I think there's a politics there too.
Sure, there's a lot. But let's turn our attention to Delegate Jones. He says his top priority, if elected, would be justice reform.
I will use the office of the Attorney General and that platform and that pulpit to continue to be a loud voice, as I have been in the legislature, to stand with my fellow Democrats who call for a more fair and just and equitable Virginia. And embedded within this is an Office of Civil Rights in the Attorney General's office that actually has teeth, that has investigatory and enforcement powers that can protect people, that can go after incidents of racism, whether it's in our police forces, in housing, in banking.
Worth noting that the Office of Civil Rights was created in January of this year, so it's a relatively new part of the Attorney General's office. Delegate Jones can make the argument to voters that they have the opportunity to elect someone to the office who is an African American, who has lived experience that speaks to the issue of justice reform. Is this an argument that's more compelling than Herrings' argument about gun violence prevention?
So Jones has raised some interesting points about when and where and how Herring has started investigations in police departments dealing specifically with their interactions with Black Virginians. I know like the Windsor, Herring put in or started investigations at Virginia Beach and Spotsylvania, but he kind of dropped the ball, or at least didn't show up until he was criticized for the Windsor stop where the member of the military was pulled, and man, did that video look bad. So yeah, I mean, and this is, again, one of those issues, especially when you're talking about criminal justice reform, that the Republicans are going to hit super hard during the general. And I think the state party, we say the state party, but let's face it. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if Democrats nationally stepped in just because they don't want to have an embarrassing loss this year. If they stepped in and said, hey, don't mention this, part one, part two, we'll give you money if you don't mention this. So I don't know. It's a great idea. And Lord knows the state has a lot of civil rights issues that it needs to work through. But between the limited power that I think the AG's office already has, I just don't know what more either I guess candidate could do going forward, but who knows?
Yeah, this Office of Civil Rights is something that, from Herring's perspective, he wanted to do this for a long time. And when Republicans were in power, he worked with Delegate Lopez to try to create an Office of Civil Rights. And that didn't happen because Republicans were in power and they killed it. So when Democrats came in power, Herring worked with the other Herring, Leader Herring, to create this Office of Civil Rights. Now, it's true that Delegate Jones had an alternative version of that. So there were sort of warring versions there between Leader Herring's version and Delegate Jones's version. Mel, this issue of the Office of Civil Rights is something you hear about on the campaign trail all the time. Jones thinks this could be a wedge issue. Is that going to work?
I think a lot of different AG's offices, even at the federal level, the Justice Department has an Office of Civil Rights, and it doesn't go away when, a more conservative or less progressive person takes hold of that agency. I think he could successfully make the point that the office will only go as far or do as much as the person in leadership, and it seems that he's making the case that as a Black man in America, he can wield the limited power of this office to do more good than Herring could.
All right, let's take a break. We're going to come back. We'll talk about wrongful convictions and protecting voters against intimidation.
The Freddie Mac Multifamily Podcast brings together industry leaders to talk through current issues and important housing trends. Hear from our hosts and their expert guests by searching Freddie Mac Multifamily wherever you get your podcasts.
And I'll tell you what doesn't help is when we have reporters like Michael Pope from WVTF. These were not rioters and looters. These were patriots. I never called the people who stormed the Capitol patriots. These were not rioters and looters. These were patriots. I never called the people who stormed the Capitol patriots. We have to hold our media accountable.
You can help our podcast hold people in power accountable. Head over to transitionvirginia.com and hit the button that says Contribute on Patreon. For as little as $3 a month, you can help us speak truth to power. And we're back on Transition Virginia. We're talking about the Democratic primary for Attorney General. Now, Mark Herring is the incumbent, and he's got a challenger, Delegate Jay Jones. Now, one of the issues that's been a flashpoint during a recent candidates forum was a new conviction integrity unit. Here's what Mark Herring said about the new office.
To wrongfully convict someone is to deny them their freedom and countless opportunities. And so that's why I created the state's first statewide conviction integrity unit, so that additional resources, additional lawyers could be brought in to more proactively identify wrongful convictions and then get them overturned.
But Delegate Jones says the timing of this new office is dubious.
This justice system has been skewed against certain populations for far too long. It is inequitable. That is a fact. And so as we move ahead, we've got to continue to prioritize seeking truth, but doing it in a way that is consistent and not just popping up when we have elections. And I want to make sure everybody's aware that we are supposed to be just and supposed to seek truth at all times, not just in June and November.
So it seems like everybody thinks this conviction integrity unit is a good idea, but is the timing of it dubious? Mel, we'll start with you.
I think on a lot of issues, including the civil rights unit, for example, Jones has tried to make the point that things that he's been pushing for, obviously he's a really big voice on criminal justice reform in the legislature. Herrings sort of follows. I think this is an issue that Democrats are interested in right now, this idea of people being wrongfully convicted, and that being a product of, systemic racism in the criminal justice system. So I don't know that he'll be able to firmly make that point, especially if it's something that both of these candidates are appealing to care about.
This seems like an issue that will animate a primary, but will all but disappear after the primary is wrapped because of concerns about Republican turnout and Republicans using any kind of criminal justice. I was talking to some friends' parents from 757. They were helping them move up here in Richmond, and they're, 60-year-old Republicans. They couldn't vote for Trump because of some of the stuff he said about veterans. But I asked them both if they'd ever heard of Virginia's parole board, just to see how that issue was landing as far as criminal justice wedge issues go. And neither of them had any idea what the parole board was, let alone the scandal associated with it. So while I think Democrats are going to want to talk about the progressive nature of sentencing reform and about integrity and convictions, I think this is going to be a primary issue that both candidates are going to hit hard. But once they get past the primary, I think they're going to be too scared to mention much of it. So whether or not it makes the impact with the primary voters will be seen. And you got to give credit to Jones for pushing real hard on this. But, he's a state delegate. His district is going to be the one who sees him talk about it the most. Meanwhile, Herring gets the entire platform. So as much as Jones has been mad about Herring following in his footsteps, Herring's still the one who gets the headlines when he announces it.
I would say, too, that this issue has probably reached the more average voter in terms of the conversation about repealing the death penalty, which obviously Governor Northam signed at that time when Northam signed that bill. He talked a lot and other leaders talked a lot about people being wrongfully convicted and the brokenness within the criminal justice system. And so I think this is just an issue that has wide appeal. And while Delegate Jones has certainly been a powerful voice in terms of criminal justice reform in the legislature, I think it's something that Democrats in general are focused on.
Yeah, so we've got the conviction integrity unit and debate going on, but there is also the issue of election integrity. And it's not just Republicans talking about the big lie. Election integrity is also an issue on the Democratic side, where Delegate Jones says that General Herring isn't doing enough to protect election integrity, and he wants to create a new office to protect those voters.
I'm so proud of the fact that we announced the intention to create a voter protection and election integrity unit here in Virginia. We saw instances of discrimination and intimidation in Fairfax just last year, and we can't stand for that. That this doesn't exist already is downright shocking to me.
But Herring says he's taken a number of actions to protect voters.
We went into court and got a court agreement to make sure that the witness requirement on absentee ballots was waived. My team worked to make sure that when Trump tried to make it harder for people to vote by mail by sabotaging the Postal Service, we sued him and got an injunction to block it. And when some Trump supporters went to Fairfax on the first day of early voting and engaged in the activity that could potentially have been voter intimidation, I immediately put out a legal opinion laying out the state and federal laws that prohibit it so everyone would know that That is not permitted or tolerated in Virginia.
Does Virginia need a new office to protect voters, or is this something that the AG should be doing anyway, if there's a new office or not?
I love Herring taking credit for the waiver of signatures. I mean, I guess he technically does, because if I'm not mistaken, that was instigated by a lawsuit from ACLU. The ACLU dispute over witness signatures, I'm pretty sure, was mediated and settled by a judge. They also had Lee Carter's lawsuit over reducing the number of signatures required to get on the ballot. That was another thing that I believe was a settlement between the two. So, whether or not Herring gets to take credit for a lot of this stuff or whether it's the result of plaintiffs is certainly up to debate, but he's going to campaign on it either way, it seems. But yeah, I mean, I don't know if this really tracks as an issue, because I think if the moment you use the word voter integrity, I think Democrats get turned off by it because of the big lie and because of the association with it. And as for the protests in Fairfax County, I remember the legal opinion going out. I don't know if it ever got utilized. I'd be surprised to try and it would be a really bad look to have cops arresting protesters at a ballot box, a polling station. But I mean, he's certainly wanted to start the fight, so we'll see.
Since Mark Herring has been in office, he created the Office of Civil Rights. He created a worker protection unit. He created the conviction integrity unit, which we talked about. He reorganized the consumer protection section. So does this office need yet another unit, Mel? I mean, is this sort of unit creep, essentially?
And I just wonder if maybe among the most progressive parts of the party, this would sound like a good idea. I just also think that there are a lot of more fiscally conservative Democrats out there, or just people who are dissatisfied with the government, which, includes people from both parties who just don't want to see, more money going to the bureaucracy, just people sitting in an office, maybe doing something notable every once in a while. And so not that that's true, but I think that it's a perception that is out there. And so I wonder if the idea of pitching it as a new office as opposed to just doubling down and focusing on that work would have wider appeal. And I think to Brad's point, the other thing that he mentioned in his clip is about working to push back on changes by the Trump administration to the Postal Service. That's something that he did in conjunction with a lot of attorney generals who were also similarly worried that the delays or changes at the post office would impact their elections.
You use the word perception, which is really key to this debate here, because Herring would say, look, protecting voters and protecting election integrity is something that this office should be doing it anyway. And as Attorney General, here's what I've done. You heard the sound clip, X, Y, Z, A, B, C. He had a long list of things that he was taking credit for. And then Jones is saying, hey, we need a new unit to show that it's a priority of mine. It's something we're going to take seriously. So, I mean, there's the Herring argument that says, look, we've been doing this all along. And then there's the Jones argument to say, hey, look, we're going to have a focus on this. Brad, do you see either one of those sort of outweighing the other?
Well, I think Mel's super correct about voters getting concerned about expanding AG like sub offices. But I think the ironic point there is the AG's office is probably super minimal compared to other states, especially as, Republicans fear we turn into New York, California. I would imagine Virginia's legacy as a red, if not purple state has probably left a lot of our bureaucratic institutions super understaffed and super underfunded. So creating some of these offices might sound bad, but they could probably address a lot of issues. Worker protections. Lord knows how many individuals would benefit from enforcing labor laws better. Those are two things that businesses really don't want to see happen. So there's also that, and see where the wedge between the business community widens in Virginia as it shifts to the left. While the offices may not have existed, these are all technically responsibilities of the AG's office to begin with, if it was empowered by the general legislature to do so. So either of them announcing new offices begs the question, do you need a new office to do this, or can you just do it?
And not to get too wonky, but we do have elections in Virginia every year, and the Voting Rights Act of Virginia that the governor signed, and that was sponsored by Senator Jen McClellan and Delegate Sia Price, does put more work on the Office of the Attorney General. They essentially now have a broader duty to make sure that voters aren't being discriminated against and that localities are not essentially changing the elections to make it harder for certain groups to vote. And so whether there's a new office or not, I think the legislature this year has given the Office of the Attorney General extra work when it comes to making sure that voters are protected.
All right, well, let's take a break. When we come back, we're going to discuss endorsements.
Has it been a while since you flipped that thermostat from heat to cool? Turn to the experts at Griffith Energy Services before you do for an $88 AC start and check to make sure your AC is in tip-top shape. Griffith specializes in Carrier, but services all brands. Visit GriffithEnergyServices.com today. Your local Carrier expert. That's GriffithEnergyServices.com. License number MDHVACR 01-2278.
Griffith Energy Services. Doggone dependable.
Hey, you. Yes, you. You're listening to Transition Virginia right now, and you're probably a fan of the podcast, right? Well, then rate and review, like Trevor Sutherland.
1 star. The only time I listen is when I'm on.
That's not really what I was thinking. Well, how about this review from Richard Krause?
This piece of shit podcast, I wouldn't even rate 1 star.
Come on, listeners. I know you can do better than that. Hit the pause button right now and give us a quick review. And we're back on Transition Virginia. We're talking about the Democratic primary for Attorney General, and it's a campaign that's splitting Democrats. And perhaps this is particularly noticeable in the endorsements. Here's Delegate Jones talking about his endorsements.
I am so excited about the fact that Governor Northam has endorsed our campaign. He and Pam are all in, along with Congresswoman Elaine Luria, former Attorney General Mary Sue Terry, and a number of members of the General Assembly who believe in our energy, our passion, our conviction.
Now, the governor also appears in a campaign video with Jones.
Great to see you. Good to see you, man.
This campaign is about leading the way on criminal justice reform and police reform.
My proudest day, and you were standing right there beside me, was when we ended the death penalty.
Governor, we're reckoning with our past, and there's so much at stake in the future. And that's why I'm running for Attorney General, to continue to build upon the work that we've done.
Virginians are excited that Jay Jones is going to be the next Attorney General.
I'm so proud to have your support because we've got so much more to accomplish.
How much does this endorsement from Governor Northam really mean for Jones? Will this carry the day and help him knock off the incumbent?
Well, I think it could help his fundraising, certainly. But I also think that, for example, in the governor's race, McAuliffe has gotten so many endorsements from all of these powerful Democrats. And I think that that's made it a little bit more challenging for the other candidates to get more momentum. I think Northam coming out pretty early for Jones, I think helped prop him up as somebody that, you know, a lot of the sort of big fundraisers could get behind. I think that that was pretty major for him. I reported this a few months ago, but part of what drove the endorsement was Northam's relationship with Jones. He said in his statement that he's known him since he was pretty young. And has known his family. His dad, he called him affectionately the judge. But the other consideration somebody in Northam's camp told me is that Jones is from Hampton Roads, and Northam is very interested in there being a candidate from Hampton Roads in the Democratic statewide ticket. And so I think Northam sort of promoting that could also help him a lot.
The biggest surprise of the decade is undoubtedly Northam's rebound after the blackface scandal. So to me, the endorsement seemed like the final brick in the wall trying to bury that topic. So I thought that was interesting. I mean, every step he's taken this legislative session has obviously been an effort to push back on that story. For what end? I mean, what is Northam going to run for after this? I just don't know what role the Northam endorsement serves. Mel's point about getting somebody from 757 on the ballot makes a ton of sense, especially in the context of the voters they need to get to show up to polls this November. Again, I think the biggest point of this election is going to be Democrats still afraid of the state's history of flipping the opposite way of the presidency. And when you have somebody as, for the most part, non-controversial as Biden, you can get complacent Democrats who think, especially after a decade of statewide wins, that they don't have to show up anymore. And to get somebody from 757 makes sense because that will be a base in which the Democrats will need as many votes as humanly possible. And having two white guys on the bill is classic Virginia, but that's a fear that, anybody smart should have. And I think Northam, I don't know who's guiding him through it, or if what the state party's role in it is, or if they're involved in it at all. Probably not. But I think he's got a good point about diversifying the ticket a bit more.
And just for clarity for listeners, so if McAuliffe, who's gotten probably the most prominent leadership endorsements, is on the ticket, followed by Halayala, whom Northam, the House Speaker, and the Majority Leader have endorsed, and then Mark Herring, if that's the statewide ticket, those are all candidates from Northern Virginia, essentially. So
I thought I saw a pool with, what is it, Rasul was doing pretty well for the LG. Is that not up to date, or are you just talking about endorsements?
Just talking about endorsements, Rasul definitely has more money than anyone else in the LG's race. I think Ayala, her fundraising numbers were not that great last month. She, in recent weeks, has gotten a lot of prominent endorsements from Democrats.
It strikes me as curious that the sitting governor is not endorsing the sitting attorney general, and the last governor has not endorsed his sitting attorney general. Certainly gives me pause as a Democrat as to, well, what's the reason for that? Is this going to trip up Democratic voters? Obviously, Jay Jones hopes it will. What should we be reading into that?
Well, I don't know why McAuliffe hasn't endorsed, and I just don't know if maybe it wouldn't be right for like a candidate in the primary to be endorsing right now. I don't know if that's the reason. I think for Northam, he is closer personally to Jones, and one thing that is worth mentioning is that Herring did call for him to resign over the blackface revelations. Just weeks, I think it might have been just days before he said that he himself had appeared in blackface. And so I don't know that relationship ever healed all of the way. I think certainly there are people that are way more out of favor with Northam than Mark Herring, but I just wondered if that weighed in. I know that Jones also called on Northam to resign through the Black Caucus, but I don't think he himself independently put out any sort of statement or spoke about that.
I think endorsements, I think they can matter in the primary because of how it filters down into how the local races get seen with their endorsed counterparts. But yeah, I mean, I don't know how much weight endorsements carry these days compared to how important it is from a fundraising standpoint. Like Mel said, like getting those bigger names behind you is a good way to get checks, which those checks can then buy, the constant barrage of mailers and airtime. But, I'm not even sure of the success of those programs anymore these days.
On the McAuliffe question about endorsing Herring, he's been criticized a lot, or at least prodded, as to why he, a white man, is running. When he entered the race, he was running against 3 Black Virginians. And so I wonder if part of the calculation is that maybe it would be a bad look for McAuliffe himself to go ahead and endorse Herring who was running against a Black candidate.
To be fair, I think the only color McAuliffe sees is green.
Well, let's get on to Mark Herring, because Herring has his own list of endorsements. Here's an ad Majority Leader Charnel Herring cut for Mark Herring.
He's led on criminal justice reform and ending police violence. He's fought the Trump administration to protect our health care. He fought and won on the Muslim ban, on marriage equality, on Confederate propaganda. He stood with us. For Attorney General, I stand with Mark Herring.
So Herring endorses Herring, but she's not alone. Here's Senator Louise Lucas.
What Mark Herring has done has just illuminated what an attorney general can do. So we need to stand with Mark and make sure that we keep him in the attorney general's office. There's been no one that I've known in my time in the Senate of Virginia since 1992 that there's been anybody better than Mark Herring. I mean that too.
She means that too. And Henrico Commonwealth's attorney, Shannon Taylor.
I thought about running for attorney general myself because Mark's shown us how the office can be a powerful force for good. And right now, the office is in good hands. So when I heard Mark Herring was running again for attorney general, well, he's got my vote. And I hope he'll have yours.
Interesting endorsement considering Shannon Taylor was thinking about a run for attorney general herself. And it looks like this is a battle royale of endorsements. So who's going to win this WrestleMania?
I would also add to your list House Speaker Eileen Filler-Corn. I spoke to her about her decision to endorse Mark Herring, and she said he's somebody that has a proven record of doing a good job in this office, and I think that is what is going to drive a lot of people. And she said that was behind her decision. She'd worked with him a long time, and she said he was proven at his job.
Yeah, I definitely don't think your average voter even knows who some of these endorsement folks are, let alone when they're supposed to vote next. So the endorsements matter in the primary, yes, because like I said, I think that trickles down into how party members and how more loyal and regular Democrats choose to vote. But I don't know. I mean, I feel like this is wading too much into the reeds as far as inside baseball goes. And, the fundraising will help, which will turn into ads, which will clog screens and so forth.
I think it would be worth just noting that the most recent poll in the race showed Mark Herring leading Jones 42 to 18%, with about a third of voters still undecided. I think obviously the part that hurts Jones there is just the name ID when you've been doing a job for, as long as Mark Herring's been doing it, whether they like you or not, people know who you are.
Yeah, it's really interesting, that point, that before he was at 18%, he was at 3%, and the Jones people attribute that to the governor's endorsement. So that's about 15% from a governor's endorsement. They say all of the undecided since the endorsement have broken their way. But if there's still a third undecided, I don't know how long that's going to hold, because it's a lot easier for Mark Herring to get to 50 plus. And you also just need to be the top vote getter in Virginia to win, right? So there's a lot less ground for Herring to cover than Jones after a 15% bump.
We should also just note that early voting has already started. We're talking about the race as being more than a month away, but reality is that, some people have already started to cast their votes. And if, trends hold with what we saw in November, a lot of people might do so early. So I guess the timing that Jones has to expand his name ID that window is quickly shrinking.
I mean, I also think it's important to know that A.G. Herring is the face of the Attorney General's office, and then the actual people doing the groundwork are the folks who are really moving the needle in a lot of these disputes. I heard Herring give Herring credit for Civil War propaganda, and I've been following those cases particularly well. I mean, a lot of the cases the AG's office is involved in. And I mean, the staff there is incredible. Solicitor General Heitens I read and listen to a lot of court disputes, and he is an absolute joy to listen to, which I know sounds weird. I'm very boring at parties, but yeah, in the end, I think the thing that will not change the most is a lot of the general mission of the AG's office. Is if a Democrat keeps the seat, which they most likely will, then you'll see just good lawyering continue to come out of the office because of the staff underneath. I mean, I don't think they talk about staffing decisions beforehand or what the nature of the staffing is. But again, I think that's been the most, at least from my standpoint, from my very boring standpoint, the most impressive part of the Attorney General's office for me has come from the staff below.
So I'm going to take issue with something Brad just said there, which is totally incorrect. He's not boring at parties. In fact, he is the unofficial party animal of the Virginia Capital Correspondents Association. So any predictions? I know predictions is a dangerous game. Mel, any predictions? Brad, any predictions? Thomas, any predictions? Before we end the podcast.
I think it would be a major upset if Jones won.
I think Jones is younger than me, so I look forward to seeing Jones run for statewide again and being successful. I think this is a great year for him. I like him a lot. I like his fight, and I like the angles, the direction he's going in a lot of things, and I think the voters will too. But I think name recognition, especially in a primary, especially in a statewide, is going to be the most important thing right now if Democrats want to hold that position, hold that seat. And I think the party's too nervous to try something too new after everything they've done legislatively. But I think Jones can run again several times, as many times as needed, before we probably see him on the ballot for governor at some point.
Yeah, I agree. I think if Ralph had wanted somebody from Hampton Roads, he should have endorsed Andrea McClellan, because there's no one making the case it's time to fire Mark Herring. He's done a perfectly good job. All of the Democratic AGs serving across the United States have all endorsed Mark Herring. That sends a pretty powerful signal to the layman.
It's a fundraising message, but go ahead. Sorry.
Sure. Like, it's a fundraising message to some people and it's a cue to other people.
Yeah.
Like I said, if Herring is sitting at 42%, okay, maybe he's getting minimal traction, but the vast majority of people who walk into that polling booth undecided, if anybody, are going to pull the lever for the person that they recognize.
I think it's worth noting that Delegate Jones has shown that he has a lot of fundraising promise. He's really kind of right there neck and neck with somebody who's been in Virginia politics for a very long time. And I think that shows something about his promise down the line.
Yeah, but where's that money coming from, right? Like, he's gotten a couple big checks from one guy.
Who's the one guy?
Michael Bills, Sonia Smith, Clean Virginia.
Yeah, I was going to say, is that the environmental?
Big Virginia funders.
Yeah. He's their candidate, and I don't think they're going to pull it off this time. So that's all for this episode.
Support us on Patreon or send us an email to transitionvapodcast@gmail.com.
Like and follow at TransitionVA on Twitter and anywhere pods are cast.
Read the transcripts at transitionvirginia.com, and special thanks to Emily Cottrell for figuring out what the heck we're saying.
Thanks for being on the transition team. We're your hosts, Thomas Bowman.
And I'm Michael Pope.
At Facebook, we've tripled our safety and security teams and invested billions to keep our platforms safe. What's next? We support updated internet regulations that set clear rules for addressing today's toughest challenges. Learn more at about.fb.com/regulations.
Is it time for a new heating and cooling system? Turn to the experts at Griffith Energy Services and Carrier today and get 0% financing for 18 months on a new heating and cooling system. Get the comfort you deserve from Griffith Energy Services and Carrier. Visit griffitenergyservices.com today for this and other exclusive offers. That's griffitenergyservices.com. License number MD HVACR 01-2278.
Griffith Energy Services.